If you can't tell from this opening section of the video, I love this game. This one has got to be one of my favorite Final Fantasies. As the last of the Final Fantasies on the SNES, Final Fantasy VI certainly ended off with a bang. It brought about, in my opinion, one of the best character-driven stories in the series, and we see a lot of these influences in Final Fantasy XIV. So without further ado, this is Final Fantasy VI references in Final Fantasy XIV. As always, this is your spoiler warning, as there are story elements from both games being discussed in this video. Final Fantasy VI was released in 1994 for the Super Famicom system in Japan, and was released as Final Fantasy III for the Super Nintendo in the West. On the box art for the Super Famicom, we see one of the main characters, Terra Bramford. This art from Yoshitaka Amano also depicts the Magitek armor she is riding on. This version of the Magitek armor appears in Final Fantasy XIV as a mount that can be obtained after finishing the original A Realm Reborn storyline. The theme that plays when riding this mount, which can be heard at the beginning of Final Fantasy VI, is a variation of Terra's theme. The Magitek armor that appears in-game in Final Fantasy VI, however, also appears as its own mount and is obtainable in a chest after the Alamigo dungeon. There are many characters within Final Fantasy VI. In fact, the most of any single-player Final Fantasy game, and all of them offer many unique abilities. Many of these abilities make their way into Final Fantasy XIV. The character Edgar has abilities that appear with the machinist job in 14. Abilities such as auto crossbow, drill, bioblaster, chainsaw, and air anchor. First appeared in Final Fantasy VI. The gladiator skill Riot Blade, the dragoon skill Mirage Dive, and the samurai skill Tsubame Gaeshi are all abilities that come from Terra, Locke, and Cyan's desperation attacks, respectively. And the Scholar Limit Break Angel Feathers come from the Esper Seraph. There aren't many minions this time around, but we still have some to talk about. We have the Wind-Up Realm, Gestahl, and the Wind-Up Kefka. The Wind-Up Realm can be obtained by purchasing the Art of Ishgard Stone and Steel book. Gestahl can be found on the Heaven on High silver haloed sacks, and also from the Waterside Exploration 18 and 19. And the Wind-Up Kefka can be found at the end of the Sigmascape raid. Speaking of the Sigmascape raid, the mount obtainable after the Sigmascape Savage raid is the Air Force mount, which is a reference to the Air Force boss in Final Fantasy VI. There is also the Air Force 1 gate in the Gold Saucer, in which you play on an Air Force to shoot down targets. And while we're at the Gold Saucer, the only gear set that references Final Fantasy VI is the Gambler's outfit, which can be obtained with MGP at the Gold Saucer. This is a reference to Setzer's outfit in Final Fantasy VI. So let's talk about a few characters. We start out with Biggs and Wedge. Their first appearance was in Final Fantasy VI, and famously are references to the Biggs and Wedge from the Star Wars franchise. While these two only appear at the beginning of Final Fantasy VI, the two names have become a recurring character alongside the likes of Cid in the Final Fantasy franchise. The next is Gogo, who we covered in the Final Fantasy V video. However, although he first appeared in Final Fantasy V, this appearance of Gogo in the Mask Carnival takes on the appearance of Gogo in Final Fantasy VI. In a faraway area of the world exists Doma. It used to be a home for many, but now is reduced to ruins by the Garlean Empire. The name Doma comes from the castle of Doma in Final Fantasy VI, in which their residents also fell victim to the Empire, and specifically to the hands of Kefka. A man by the name of Hien is a Doman that vowed to seek liberation for Doma after it fell. Hien is the son of the former leader of Doma, Cyan. Hien and Cyan are both references to the characters found in Final Fantasy VI. The former king, Cyan, references Cyan, the ruler of Doma. Hien was also known as Shun in his childhood, and this references Cyan's son's Japanese name, Shun. The theme of Hien is the rearrangement of Cyan's theme from Final Fantasy VI. When Cid lost his memory in the main story quests, he goes by the name of Marquez. This references Cid's last name in Final Fantasy VI. In fact, the two have very similar backgrounds, as both Cids have a part in creating the technology known as Magitek in both games. In the 2.0 Alchemist storyline, the Goldmaster Severian had lost his lover to the Calamity and seeks to resurrect his former lover. This references when Locke brings Phoenix to Rachel to talk to her one last time before properly saying goodbye to her. In the Churning Mists, there exist Moogles that references some of the Moogle names from Final Fantasy VI, specifically Moglin, Moghan, and Mogwin, and Mog is known as a warrior of legend in the area. And finally, in Stormblood, there is a parley between the Eorzean Alliance and the Garlean Empire, in which they discuss terms in order to end the war between the two. This is an allusion to when the Returners meet with the Empire in order to ensure that peace is restored between the two factions. Now, I want to talk about some of the Espers that make their first appearance in Final Fantasy VI. Kirin, which can be obtained after collecting all the 2.0 Extreme Trial mounts. Zona Seeker, which can be found as the S rank in Western Thanalan. Fenrir, which can be found as the final boss of the dungeon Snowcloak, and also a mount obtained in the Gold Saucer. Seraph is found as an ability from Scholar in which Eos or Selene becomes Seraph and provides stronger heals for a limited time. And Bismarck and Lakshmi, both found as trials in Heavensward and Stormblood respectively. Several bosses appear in Final Fantasy XIV are direct references to certain bosses in Final Fantasy VI. We start out with Ymir, which is the first boss you face in Final Fantasy VI. This boss first appeared in Final Fantasy XIV in the dungeon Hullbreaker Isle hard mode. The next three bosses can be found within the Castrum Urbania dungeon, the first of which is the Magna Rotor. This is based off the enemies that attack you as you escape the Magitek research facility. The next is number 24, This boss specifically has a certain affinity to a certain element and will switch its weakness every so often. The same can be said in the Final Fantasy XIV version of the fight. And finally, we have Inferno, in which it grows its arms in order to help itself in the fight. The Death Gaze appears as the first boss in Dun Scaith. Very similarly to Final Fantasy VI, Death Gaze attacks you while you're traveling on the airship. Next, we have the Armored Weapon, which can be found in Baelsar's Wall, and Prometheus, which can be found in the Gimlet Dark. Both bosses are found as normal mobs within Final Fantasy VI, specifically when fighting against the Empire. And finally, we have the Ultima Beast, which is found in Fractal Continuum Hard Mode, in which this model is based off the Atma weapon in Final Fantasy VI. These next two characters are very prominent characters within the Final Fantasy universe. They are Ultros and Typhon. First appearing in Final Fantasy VI, these two make their way into Final Fantasy XIV. In both games, Ultros is a comic relief character and often coupled with Typhon. These two appear as their own bosses in the Dragon's Neck Colosseum, which is a reference to the Colosseum found in Final Fantasy VI. Typhon also appears as his own gate in the Gold Saucer in Any Way the Wind Blows, and both appear in the background of Air Force One. The entire area of Azazel can be seen as a reference to Final Fantasy VI. Here, we can see many aspects such as the floating continent, the Aetherochemical Research Facility, which references the Magitek Research Facility found in Final Fantasy VI, and the Warring Triad. In both games, we eventually have to face the Warring Triad. In Final Fantasy VI, their official names were the Fiend, the Goddess, and the Demon. However, in Final Fantasy XIV, all three of them have names: Sephiroth, Sophia, and Zervan. These names came from an early concept art of the Warring Triad drawn by Tetsuya Nomura, in which they were named before they were ultimately scrapped. The music used in the first phase of all three fights is a rearrangement of the Battle to the Death theme from Final Fantasy VI. And now we move on to the Sigmascape raids. In this tier of raids, we see various fights from different bosses from Final Fantasy VI. The first three fights uses the Decisive battle theme from Final Fantasy VI. Our first fight in Sigmascape 1.0 is against the Phantom Train. The train in Final Fantasy VI is used to transport the recently deceased to the afterlife, and you must fight your way out of the Phantom Train. In this fight, we also fight the ghosts of the Phantom Train. However, there is a chance when you enter a room, you fight Siegfried instead, a famous swordsman seeking treasure. Siegfried is also found in the Mask Carnival as well. After defeating the Phantom Train, there is a short cutscene in which you are thanked by two human ghosts. This is a direct reference to the moment after defeating the Phantom Train. Elaine and Owen appear before Cyan before saying their final goodbye before departing to the afterlife. We move on to Sigmascape 2.0, in which we face off against Chatternook, a painting that has come to life. In this fight, we use various paintings in order to take care of certain mechanics of the fight. This is a reference to Realm's sketch ability, in which she can paint things and have them come to life to help the party. Next, in Sigmascape 3.0, we have the Guardian. The Guardian uses various programs in order to aid itself. This is exactly the same in Final Fantasy VI, in which he uses various programs against the returners. The Guardian calls for the help of Dataluma, Air Force, and Ultros. And finally, we face off against Kefka. In this fight, we hear Soken's arrangement of Dancing Mad. We see the statues in the background which aid Kefka. These statues are a direct reference to the statues we fight at the end of the game before meeting Kefka face to face. Once we reach the top, the heavens open up, and there, God Kefka descends. His monologue in this fight is the same word for word from the original fight in Final Fantasy VI. In this fight, he uses various abilities that we see in the original fight against God Kefka in Final Fantasy VI, such as Heartless Angel, and Forsaken. And there we have it. I'm very glad that Final Fantasy VI had so much love shown in Final Fantasy XIV, as it truly stands out as one of the all-time greats of the classic era of Final Fantasy. So many characters, settings, and ideas influenced a lot of Final Fantasy XIV, and all for the better. As always, if you like the content, please remember to like and subscribe. It will always be appreciated. And in the next video, we'll be looking at the world of Final Fantasy VII.